Hey everybody, this is Rabbit, welcome to the channel, and today we're actually going to be doing our first aircraft guide. This is going to be the Israeli Kurnass 2000, aka the Super Phantom. Now the Kurnass 2000 is kind of an interesting aircraft because it is essentially the best Phantom in the game right now. It's also arguably one of the better air support options in terms of ground battles, and it is reasonably versatile, so it's worth taking a look at. Now to briefly go over what makes it the best Phantom, you have the pulse Doppler radar, which a lot of the later Phantoms have, so it allows you to maintain locks a lot easier. You have the Agile Eagle package, so you turn better, and you also have the integrated 20mm cannon, so you don't have to take a gun pod, which reduces the weight and drag on the aircraft versus taking a gun pod, and still allows it to be a reasonably effective dogfighter. The combination of these features means that you really do have the best of every feature a Phantom could theoretically have. In addition, you also have a really good array of air-to-air and air-to-ground weapons. In terms of air-to-air weapons, you start with the AIM-9G. It's not an awful missile, it's an infrared missile, rear aspect only, so you will generally have to be able to see somebody's exhaust. Now it does have what's referred to as an uncaged seeker. That means you can lock your radar onto the target, and the seeker of the missile will essentially try to look for a target in the area that you have locked with your radar. So it can be a pretty handy feature, and the Gs do have a pretty decent range to them, but their overall pull isn't very strong. When you upgrade them, you get the AIM-9Ls. AIM-9Ls are probably the best infrared missile in the game right now. They're an all-aspect missile, so they can lock onto a target from any range. They have a pull of about 30 Gs. They do have an uncaged seeker like the G, so you can use your radar to try and target them initially. And overall, the AIM-9L, it also sometimes ignores countermeasures, but it's very inconsistent about that. So overall, it's about as good as you can get. And you can carry potentially up to 6 of them, although you likely won't. The AIM-7F Sparrows, you have the AIM-7E2, which is the dogfight, and the AIM-7F. The major difference between these missiles is the AIM-7F has considerably longer ranges, but that also means that you see the contrail from its engine for longer, so it's easier for the enemy to spot the F versus the E2, depending on the distance. That being said, most of the time the F is just as good as the E2, but it does just have better range, so it is usually just a flat-out upgrade. Now, one thing that I will note about the Sidewinders, I kind of talked about this when I was reviewing the A10 and the how to research the F-14 video. The AIM-9L is technically an all-aspect, however, if you shoot it at somebody and they see you shoot it, they're probably going to flare it, and because they have such a weak heat signature from the front, it's not really worth that shot most of the time, unless you know it's an enemy that doesn't have countermeasures. So just try to bear that in mind with the AIM-9Ls. It is the best IR missile in the game, but it's by no means infallible. Now in terms of the air-to-ground weapons, you have a good array of bombs and rockets, including Zuni rockets. Now if you mount the Zunis on the center of the airframe, in conjunction with the ballistic computer, they will be very accurate and you will fire them individually. So just the 12 pod of Zuni rockets in the center of the airframe can actually be a pretty effective cast loadout, because you can just land them incredibly accurately from long distances, and Zunis are incredibly powerful. However, the star of the show is probably going to be the Mavericks and the Paveways. The Paveway guided bombs are laser guided bombs. They're 2,000 pounders, and you have to take the targeting pod with it to laze targets. However, it is still a pretty effective bomb. It'll basically annihilate anything it touches. You also have the AGM-65D model Mavericks. These are the ones that actually track heat signatures instead of optically tracking. So these are actually more consistent and will generally operate more efficiently at a longer range than the B Mavericks that you might be used to on other aircraft. And the Mavericks are a fire and forget, the Paveways are not. So that is an important note. But overall, in terms of air-to-ground, you have good dumb bombs, you have good dumb rockets, you have good laser-guided bombs, and you have good fire-and-forget missiles. This is probably the best loadout you could theoretically ask for on a top-tier cast jet right now. Now, the Kurnass 2000, for all the technology and weapons it has, it is still ultimately a Phantom. The Agile Eagle does give it some advantages over a lot of its sister Phantoms. This handles almost identically to the F4E at 11.0. And like the F4E at 11.0, not atrocious at maneuvering, but you really don't have an advantage against a lot of the common enemies you'll fight, so you'd kind of want to end it without it becoming a prolonged maneuvering fight. You'll also lose energy pretty easily if you start doing lots of turns, so again, like, you really don't want to get into a resource trade with your opponents. And that's kind of the biggest lesson about this Phantom is you really want to try to use the AIM-7Fs or the AIM-9Ls to end the fight as quickly as possible and just break off. Trying to stay in prolonged turn fights can work, but doesn't always work. One big advantage that Kurnass has, though, and a lot of the American planes have this too, is the 20mm Vulcan. This Gatling gun is incredibly effective. It's probably the best air-to-air weapon in the game. Like, other guns technically do more damage, but the trajectory of the 20mm Vulcan is so flat, and it'll annihilate enemies even with a fairly small burst. It's just a very easy weapon to use. Now, whenever you're in an Air RB match, it's kind of important to remember that the Kurnass 2000 doesn't want to get caught out on its own in a 1v1 unless it's fighting something like another Phantom, where it basically holds all the cards. Against a lot of your common opponents like F-14s, F-16s, MiG-29s, even to an extent MiG-23s, although you can mostly handle them if you're canny about it. Against a lot of those opponents, you really don't want to get caught in a 1v1 just kind of trading resources with it, whether it be missiles, countermeasures, or energy, because at the end of the day, they will probably win. However, you do have 8 reasonably effective missiles, so a lot of your strategy is going to hinge around staying with your team and trying to find opponents that aren't paying attention to you, or opponents that are coming at you, but like trying to force them off by using the AIM-7Fs. And if once you force them off, you can go follow up with either the Sidewinders or your gun. Or sometimes they just run into the AIM-7Fs because they're just not in a good position to dodge it. That also happens a lot too. So a lot of your strategy, I'm not going to say you're a supporting fighter per se, because you do have really good weapons, and outside of the best enemies, you can actually turn fight with a lot of the things you fight, but you can also very easily run into something that wholly outclasses you, so you do have to be a little careful with Kurnass 2000, but you can have really good success in air battles. In ground battles, the Kurnass 2000, like a lot of other fixed-wing aircraft right now, is very coin-flippy, because at 10.7, you're fighting some of the best anti-aircraft systems in the game, and you also have to worry about other helicopters and other planes. So even though this is probably one of the best fixed-wing CAS options in the game, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be running people over. The big thing about the Kurnass 2000 is the versatility of weapons. If you need to take out planes, you have great anti-aircraft missiles. If you need to take out tanks from high altitude, you have the GBUs. If you need to try and counter the enemy anti-air, the Mavericks do a good job of doing that. So you can kind of tailor your loadout to whatever you're looking for in any scenario. And this is one of the reasons why I like the Kurnass 2000 as a CAS option, because a lot of other nations, I feel like I have to pick and choose between an effective fighter and an effective ground attacker, and the Kurnass just kind of does both. It's not the absolute best at both, but it's definitely good enough to be a serious problem for the enemy team, and you can even kind of do both at the same time, because the loadout with the 4 paveways, you can take Sidewinders and Sparrows with that, so now you're a danger to everything in the air and everything on the ground at the same time, which is pretty nice. Although the Mavericks do mostly shut out your ability to use the Sidewinders, which can be a little annoying. Now, in terms of loadouts, I have an entire video on custom loadouts, how they work, how to design them around spawn costs, etc, etc. Feel free to check that out. I'll put the link in the description. But right now we're going to look at the custom loadouts I am currently using. So first off, we have the Air RB one. The Air RB, we have 4 AIM-9Ls, 4 AIM-7Fs, very straightforward. There's not really a pressing reason to bring anything else, and honestly, the Kurnass gets kills easily enough that I don't feel the pressing need to bring something like bombs. You could certainly slap them to the airframe, but it actually maneuvers pretty well without the bombs. Like I said, as long as you're not running into one of the best planes in the game, if you're just running into something like another Phantom, which you see a lot, you can just outturn them, especially if you don't have any extra ordnance. So that's part of the reason why my Air RB loadout is literally just missiles. And unlike some of the other Phantoms where I might go a little light on some of the air-to-air missiles just because they're not the best or it doesn't have the best radar, this one I just go all out. These missiles are good, the radar is good, it all works. As far as the first one, this is the default cast. It's kind of what I will spawn most of the time. You have the targeting pod, you have the 4 paveways, you have the 4 AIM-9Ls, because at this point you're already at like the ceiling for the cap, so how many Sidewinders you take doesn't really matter. Same thing with the AIM-7Fs. This is just a general all-around loadout. You can bomb targets on the ground, you can kill targets in the air, both pretty easily. Next up, we have the Combat Air Patrol, or CAP loadout. This is 2 AIM-9Ls and 2 AIM-7DFs. Again, referencing my video on loadouts, the DFs have a cheaper spawn cost than the Fs because they have less range. So this is a relatively cheap option to try and clear the skies if you want to. And then, of course, we have the cheap cast below it, where we have the AIM-7Fs, the AIM-7DFs, the AIM-9Ls, and then we have the Zunis on the center line, which, like I said, just a very inexpensive, effective option. So that's one of those loadouts where you don't have a lot of spawn points, but you still want to spawn a plane, and you can still do some work in the air and on the ground with it. And lastly, we have the Maverick cast. This is just if I have a ton of spawn points. We have the 6 Mavericks, we have these 4 AIM-7Fs, because the spawn cost difference between the DFs and Fs doesn't matter when you have Mavericks. And yeah, that's just if I have a ton of spawn points and I want to clear the sky and the ground, I will go with the Maverick cast, although I do generally favor the normal cast in most scenarios. Now, part of the reason why I favor the LGBs is because you can drop them from very high altitude and then maintain speed while using them. The Mavericks can be... You can fire and forget them, but they can sometimes be very inconsistent about what they do and don't lock, and this can lead to some issues, whereas the LGB, you can launch them from pretty high altitude, pretty good distance, and still land hits on targets. So that's kind of why they're more my default than the Mavericks, even when I have the spawn points for the Mavericks. Overall, I think the Kurnass 2000 is definitely worth it if you play the Israeli tech tree. Even if you just play air battles, this is at least as good as anything else Israelis have. While the F-16 nets is pretty nice, it doesn't have any of the Sparrows, so the nets is still kind of limited in its role, whereas the Kurnass can be a little more versatile because it can engage at long range and close range fights. And then, of course, in air-to-ground, this thing just handedly outclasses everything else in the Israeli tech tree. It's clearly the best option. And it's also slightly lower BR than the nets, so you don't push yourself into a slightly worse matchmaking, but the difference is kind of irrelevant on that front, at least right now. As far as my personal thoughts on the Kurnass 2000, I absolutely love this aircraft. The F4 Phantom is one of my favorite airframes. I just love the way it looks. The Kurnass 2000 flies reasonably well. It's not as much of a brick as some of the other Phantoms can be. And it just has really good weapons, and it's really versatile, and it just kind of highlights what the Phantom does best in terms of being very versatile. So yeah, I think it's pretty much an auto pickup. If you play the Israeli air tree, I think this is... It's maybe sacrilegious, but I think it's better than the nets, because while the nets is better at maneuvering, this just has far better weapons in both air-to-air and air-to-ground. And then when you go into the air-to-ground mode, this thing just outclasses everything in the Israeli tech tree, like, by far. So it's kind of a no-brainer in the air-to-ground role as well. And yeah, I just really like the aircraft. That's the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you had fun. Hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. That really helps the channel out. And I hope to see you guys next time. Have a great day, everybody.